Settle in for this one. Get the pillow the way you like it, let the room go quiet, and let the day you had slide off you. Because tonight, I want to tell you something soft. No shouting in this story. Nobody gets what is coming to them. There is no villain in it at all. And I know that is not what people usually come for. But stay with me anyway, because I think this one is the kind you can fall asleep inside of. My name is Carla. Tonight I am 38 years old, and about 4 hours ago, I stood up in the basement of a church on a street in Erie, Pennsylvania, with my coat still on, because that basement is always cold. And somebody put a 5-year chip in my hand. It is not much to look at, a chip. It is a little disc, about the size of a poker chip, and it has a number stamped on it. And if you carry one long enough, the edges go smooth, and the paint wears out of the lettering. And it stops being a thing you can read, and turns into a thing you can only feel. That is the whole physical fact of it. You could buy 100 of them online for less than the price of a tank of gas. And yet, I drove home tonight with it in my closed fist on the steering wheel. The way you hold a key when you are walking to your car alone. And I sat in my own driveway for a while with the engine ticking as it cooled. And I cried a little. And then I laughed at myself for crying. And then I came inside and made tea and sat down to tell you about it. Because the chip is not the story. The chip is just the receipt. The story is two people who had absolutely no reason to bother with me, and who bothered with me anyway, on ordinary weeknights, in the most unglamorous ways you can imagine. A plate of eggs, a ride across town, a phone answered at 3 a.m. by a man who had to be up at 5. Let me back up and tell it right, from the beginning, slowly, the way you want a story told when you are already halfway to sleep. I grew up in Erie, which is a lake town, and if you have never spent a winter beside a great lake, I should explain that the lake makes its own weather. The wind comes off the water and picks up all that moisture and drops it on us in a way that has nothing to do with what the forecast said that morning. You can be scraping the windshield in October. You can get 18 inches in a night that the radio never saw coming. People here talk about winter the way people in other places talk about a difficult relative. With affection mostly. With a certain amount of pride in having survived it. My mother raised my sister Renee and me in a narrow house with a front porch that sagged on one side, and she did hair out of the back room. That is the family business, such as it is. My grandmother did hair. My mother did hair. I was 11 the first time I was allowed to sweep up, and 13 the first time I was allowed to do a shampoo. And I loved it. And I do not say that the way people say they loved something they got stuck with. I actually loved it. Here's what I want you to understand about doing hair, because it matters later. It is one of the last jobs where a stranger lets you touch their head. Think about that. Somebody sits down in your chair and closes their eyes and lets you put your hands on the most vulnerable part of them. And then, for some reason nobody has ever fully explained, they tell you everything. They tell you about the diagnosis. They tell you about the affair. They tell you what they have not told their own sister. You learn to hold that. You learn to say almost nothing and to keep your face easy and your hands steady. And you learn, over the years, that just about everybody is walking around with something heavy that nobody else can see. I knew that about other people for a long time before I knew it about myself. By my late 20s, I had a chair in a real salon downtown, and a book of regulars who followed me from the last place, and a little apartment above a print shop with radiators that knocked all night. I was not rich. Nobody who does hair in a town like ours is rich. But I was good, and I was busy. And on a good week, I made rent and put something aside and went out on Friday with the other girls and came home laughing. That was the part where nothing was wrong. I want to be honest about that, because people expect these stories to start with a catastrophe, with some big cinematic wound that explains everything. And mine did not. Mine started with Friday. Mine started completely normal. My mother got sick the spring I turned 30. It was fast. And it was not the kind of sick you come back from. And I moved home to be the one who did it, because Renee had 2 little kids and a husband who worked out of town, and because I was the one without anybody depending on me, and because I was the daughter who did hair and could work around it. I did her hair every week until the very end. I want to say that plainly because it is the one thing from that year I am still proud of. She was particular about her hair her whole life, and I made sure that never stopped being true for her, even when everything else stopped being true. She died on a Tuesday in November. I remember it was snowing sideways, the lake doing its worst. And after the funeral, I went back to that narrow house alone and sat in the back room with all her tools laid out in the drawer, exactly the way she left them. And I opened a bottle of wine that somebody had brought over with a casserole, and I drank the whole thing by myself. And I slept. That is it. That is the beginning. There is no dramatic scene, no rock bottom, no screaming. A woman drinks a bottle of wine after her mother's funeral and sleeps. And there is not one person on this earth who would look at that and see the start of anything. I did it again the next night, and the next. And the thing about grief is that it gives you a permission slip that does not expire. Anytime somebody looked at me a little too long, I could say, "My mom just died," and they would look away, and I could pour another one. That permission slip lasted me 2 years. Here is how it moves, in case you have somebody in your life and you are wondering. It moves so slowly that no single step looks like a step. First, it is nighttime only. Then it is nighttime, but starting earlier. Then it is a glass while you are getting ready to go out, which is not really drinking. That is just pre-gaming. Everybody does that. Then it is a glass to steady your hands before a color correction, because your hands are shaking, and you tell yourself the shaking is because of the coffee. Then one morning you understand, with total clarity and no drama whatsoever, that the shaking is not the coffee. And instead of that being the moment you stop, it is the moment you start hiding it. That is the switch, not when you drink too much, when you start lying about it. I got good at the lying the way I got good at everything else, which is to say, with practice and attention to detail. I knew which gas stations to use, so I was never at the same one twice in a week. I knew that vodka in a plastic water bottle looks exactly like water. And I knew to keep a second bottle of actual water in the same bag, so that if somebody grabbed the wrong one, I could laugh about it. I told myself I was managing. That is the word I used. I am managing. And for a while, in the way that matters to nobody but a person who is drinking, I was. I showed up. I did good work. My color was still good. My cuts were still good. I had a system. Systems fail. Mine failed on a Saturday in September, on a bridal party, which is the single worst day it could possibly have failed. 6 girls, an 8 o'clock start, a bride who had waited a year for this. I was late. Not a little late. I came in at 9:10, looking exactly like what I was, and my hands would not do the thing that my hands had done since I was 13. And the owner, a woman named Paula who had given me that chair and defended me twice already, took one look and walked me into the back office. She did not yell. I almost wish she had. She said, "Carla, I have been covering for you since your mom, and I would keep covering for you, but I cannot cover for you in front of a bride." She said, "Clean out your station." She said, "When you are ready, call me and I will help you, but not like this." And she said it kindly, and I hated her for the kindness. And I took my shears and my clips in a shoebox and walked out into a bright, cold morning with my whole identity in my arms. I lost the apartment in February. Not all at once. Nobody kicks you out in a week. It is late fees and a notice on the door, and then a court date I did not go to, and then a piece of paper that made it official. I moved back into my mother's house, which by then belonged half to me and half to Renee, and which we had been meaning to clean out and sell for 2 years. So I lived in the house where I grew up, in a room with my mother's clothes still in the closet, and I did hair out of the back room like she had, cash only, and by then it was not the same job. I would take a client at 10 in the morning, and I would need a drink at 9 to have hands, and I would need a drink at 1 to keep going. And some days I would call and say I had the flu. Renee stopped calling around then. I want to be careful here because it would be easy to tell this story as if my sister abandoned me. And that is not what happened. What happened is that I called her at 11 at night about her mother's earrings, and said things I do not remember saying, but that she can still quote. What happened is that her older boy asked why Aunt Carla talks funny. What happened is that she said, "I love you. I will help you get help. But you cannot come here like this." And I told her exactly what I thought of her house and her husband and her opinions. She did not abandon me. She put up a fence, and she stood on the other side of it and kept the porch light on. And that is a completely different thing. And it took me about 4 years to be able to see it. The last part I will tell you fast, because it is not the interesting part, and because I do not want to hand anybody a roadmap. It was a Wednesday night in the middle of October. I had eaten nothing since a granola bar. I went out for cigarettes, which was a 15-minute drive I had made 1,000 times. And I came around the curve where the road drops toward the water. And I put my mother's Buick into a mailbox and the corner of a fence. Nobody was hurt. I need you to hear that because it is the single luckiest fact of my life. And there is no version of this story where I get to be proud of that luck. There was nobody on that road. There was a mailbox belonging to a man named Frank, 76 years old, who came out on his porch in a bathrobe at midnight to see if I was alive. He called it in. Of course he did. And I sat on the frozen shoulder of that road with my hands in my sleeves and watched the lights come up over the hill. And I remember thinking, very calmly, well, there it is. I spent that night in a cell. I was 33 years old. I had a mother who was dead, a sister who would not answer, no job, no driver's license, a house I could not afford the taxes on, and a shoebox with my shears in it in the trunk of a car that was now on a flatbed somewhere. And at some point in the small hours, in a room with a light that never goes off, I stopped being able to hold the story together, the one where I was managing. Court came later. There was a fine, and there was a suspension, and there was an assessment I was ordered to do, and there was a piece of paper that said I had to attend meetings and get them signed. Signed. Like a permission slip from school. And that is the only reason I walked into that church basement the first time. I want to be truthful about that, because I think people imagine that everybody who gets sober had some shining moment of surrender. Mine was a signature. I went because a judge told me to, and I went with my arms crossed, and I sat in the back row, and I planned to leave the second somebody signed my paper. The basement is under a stone church on a corner where the wind comes straight up from the water. Concrete floor, folding chairs, a coffee urn from what I would guess is the 1970s, and a card table with cookies that somebody's wife makes, and a poster on the wall with the steps on it, and a radiator that clanks like somebody is hitting it with a wrench. There were maybe 20 people. A guy in scrubs who had clearly come straight off a shift. 2 women my age. A kid who could not have been 22, bouncing his knee so hard the whole row of chairs moved. A man in a Carhartt jacket who looked like he had been carved out of the same stone as the church. That was Walt. 77 years old at the time, 41 years at the locomotive plant, retired, hands like catcher's mitts, a voice like gravel in a bucket. He had a chip in his pocket that he took out and turned over while people talked, and the number on it had worn off years ago. Nobody made me talk. That surprised me. I had braced for it, the way you brace for a needle. They asked if anybody was new, and I did not raise my hand, and nobody looked at me, and the meeting just went on around me like weather. At the end, I went up with my little form, feeling about 2 inches tall, and asked, "Who signs these?" And Walt took it and signed it against the wall with a pen from his shirt pocket, and handed it back and said, "Same time Thursday." I said, "I am only here for the paper," and he said, "That is fine. The paper is here Thursday too." That was it. That was the entire first conversation. He did not ask me my story. He did not tell me I was in denial. He did not say a single one of the things I had my arguments ready for. He just told me where the door would be, and then he let me go stand out in the cold and wait for the bus. I went Thursday. For the paper. And Sunday. For the paper. And by the second week, I noticed that I was getting there 15 minutes early to help with the chairs, and I told myself that was because the basement was warmer than my mother's house, which was true, and also not the reason. Now let me tell you about the diner, because the diner is the other half of this. There is a place on the main drag near the corner where the bus turns. One of those long, low buildings with a counter and 8 booths, and a hand-painted bird on the window. And everybody in that part of town calls it the Bluebird. Open until midnight. Coffee that is not good and never claimed to be. The kind of place where the menus have been laminated so many times, the corners are the thickness of a dime. The night meeting let out at 8:30. And my bus did not come until 9:10, and it was the middle of November, which beside that lake is already winter, and the Bluebird was 40 steps from the stop. That is the whole reason I ever went in. It was warm, and it was there. The waitress on nights was named Donna. She was 64 then, with reading glasses on a chain and a pen behind her ear, and the kind of forearms you get from carrying 4 plates at a time for 40 years. She had a way of arriving at your table without seeming to have crossed the room. The first night I went in with $3 in change and ordered coffee, and I sat in the last booth, the one by the window with the crack in the vinyl repaired with tape, and I nursed that cup for 35 minutes and left everything I had on the table, which was not a tip, it was just everything I had. The second night she filled the cup before I asked, and set down a plate of scrambled eggs and 2 pieces of toast that I had not ordered. I said I did not order that. She said, "Kitchen made it wrong for somebody else. It is going in the trash otherwise." Now, I had been lying to people professionally for 4 years, and I knew a lie when it was handed to me on a plate with a little cup of jelly on the side. And I want to tell you what that particular lie did to me, because it is the exact hinge this whole story turns on. She did not say, "Honey, you look like you need to eat." She did not say, "Are you okay?" She did not put a hand on my arm and use a soft voice, which would have humiliated me so badly I would never have come back. She told me a small, obvious, generous lie that let me keep my dignity, and then she walked away and refilled somebody else's cup and left me alone with it. I ate the eggs. I ate all of them. It was the first hot food I had eaten in 2 days. That became the thing. Tuesday, Thursday, Sunday. Meeting at 7, bus at 9:10, and in between, the last booth at the Bluebird, and a cup that never got below the halfway mark. And, some nights, a plate of something the kitchen made wrong. The kitchen at the Bluebird made a lot of mistakes that winter. Remarkable place. I have thought about it many times since, about how many plates of eggs a woman, on a waitress's wages, quietly paid for, and about the fact that she never once said so. Not then, not later, not ever. Not even when I asked her about it straight out, years later. She just said, "You were cold." Like that settled it. And I suppose it did. I got a sponsor around week 5. That is a word I should probably explain if you have never been in those rooms. A sponsor is just somebody who has been doing it longer than you, who agrees to answer the phone and walk you through the work and tell you the truth when you are lying to yourself. It is not therapy. Nobody is trained. It is just a person a few miles further up the same road who agrees to look back over their shoulder for you. Walt was not supposed to be mine. There are people who will tell you a woman ought to be sponsored by a woman. And there are good reasons for that. And I had one for a while. A nurse named Michelle, who moved to Charlotte in the spring. But Walt was the one who was always there. And Walt was the one whose number I actually had. And after a while, we stopped worrying about how it was supposed to look. He gave me 2 rules the first night I asked him for help, and he gave them to me in the parking lot, with the wind coming sideways off the water, and I have never forgotten either one. The first was, "Call me before, not after." He said, "Everybody calls after. After is easy. After you already know what happened. Call me when you are standing in the parking lot of the store and you have not gone in yet. Call me when the thought is still just a thought. That is the only call that changes anything." The second was, "You do not have to want this yet." He said, "You keep coming, and one day you will notice you want it." Nobody wants it at the start. If people had to want it at the start, there would be nobody in that room. I said, "What if I call you and you are asleep?" He said, "I am 77. I am always asleep. Call anyway." Now, I have told the front of this story a lot of times, at podiums and in kitchens, and this is the part where people expect it to turn. This is the part where the music would come up. Woman meets old-timer, woman meets waitress, woman gets sober. Roll credits. That is not what happened. What happened is that I made it about 4 months, and then, in February, on a night when the wind was doing that thing where it sounds like something is trying to get in, I drank. I'm going to tell you about that night, because leaving it out would make this whole story a lie, and because I think somebody listening tonight needs to hear the part where it does not go in a straight line. But first, let me tell you what 4 months of it actually looked like, because the 4 months mattered, even though I threw them away. And because if you only ever hear about the falling, you will think that is the whole shape of the thing. I got up in the morning. That sounds like nothing. It is not nothing. For 4 years I had gotten up because I had to. And now, I got up because it was morning. And there is a difference you can feel in your chest. I cleaned out my mother's closet, finally, one bag at a time, with the radio on. Took me 9 days. I kept a green sweater and her good scissors, and a photograph of her at 19, standing on a dock in white sandals, laughing at whoever was holding the camera. And I have that photograph on my dresser right now. I started walking to the meeting instead of taking the bus when the weather allowed, which is a 40-minute walk, and I want you to picture that, because it is one of my favorite pictures of myself. A woman in a second-hand parka, walking along a lake road in the dark, with her hands in her pockets, going somewhere on purpose. Somewhere in there, I got a driver's license back. Sort of. Not the real one. The court gave me a limited one. Work and meetings and the grocery store. Nothing else. And a device wired into the ignition that I had to blow into before the engine would turn over. And that I paid for myself every month. Which is exactly as humbling as it sounds. There is nothing like sitting in a parking lot in the rain, blowing into a plastic tube in front of God and everybody, to keep a person honest about where she has been. I got a job. Not hair. I could not do hair yet. My license had lapsed, and my hands were not steady, and, more to the point, I was not ready to have people sit down in my chair and tell me their lives. I got hired in the laundry at a nursing home out on the east side, second shift, folding sheets in a room that ran about 90 degrees. It was the best job I ever had. I am not being ironic. There was a radio, and there was a woman named Bernice who had worked there 22 years and who taught me the fold she used. And there was a very specific pleasure in taking a cart of chaos and turning it into stacks of clean, warm rectangles, over and over, for 8 hours, with nobody asking me anything. And in the 3rd month, one of the aides found out what I used to do for a living, and asked if I would trim a resident's hair. A woman named Eleanor, 91, who had not had it done in a year because her daughter lived in Arizona, and the mobile lady had quit. I did it in the sunroom with a towel and a comb and a pair of shears out of a shoebox. It took 12 minutes. When I turned her to the window so she could see, she put her hand up to her own head, and she said, "Oh." And then she started crying. And so did I. And neither of us said anything about it. That was the first time since my mother died that I understood I still had something to give anybody. I want to be careful not to oversell it. It was a haircut. But I walked out to the parking lot afterward and stood in the cold and put my hands over my face. Because it turns out you can go a very long time without being useful and not know how much it was costing you. So that was the 4 months. Sheets and meetings and eggs at the Bluebird and a walk along the lake and an old woman's hair in a sunroom. All of it small, none of it the kind of thing anybody would put in a story. And then February. There is a particular week in February in a lake town where the whole thing stops being weather and starts being a condition. The snow is not white anymore. It is that gray-brown ridge along the road that never goes away. It gets dark at 5. Everybody is sick. The sky is one flat color for 11 days. And on the 12th of February, which would have been my mother's birthday, I worked a double, and I came out at 11 at night to a car that would not start. A 19-year-old sedan I had bought for $800 from a guy at the meeting. Not the device, just a battery, on the coldest night of the year, in a lot at the far end of a nursing home where the lights on that side had been out since Christmas. That is all it was, a car that would not start on my dead mother's birthday. I did not decide to drink. I want to be precise about this because it is the part people get wrong. There was no moment where I waited. There was a moment where I was standing in a parking lot listening to a starter click. And then there was a moment where I was standing in the fluorescent light of the store across the road, the one I had walked past twice a shift for 4 months without seeing it. And I do not have a good account of the 10 minutes in between. My body knew the route. I had Walt's number in my pocket. That is the thing. I stood at that counter with his number in my pocket, and I did not call. Because calling before means admitting that there is a before, and I was not going to admit anything at 11 at night on my mother's birthday. One of the aides gave me a ride home. She lived out past the bridge, and she went right by my street. And she talked the whole way about her son's basketball team, and never once looked over at the plastic bag on my lap. And I have wondered since whether that was luck or manners. I went into the house I grew up in, and I sat in the back room where she used to do hair. And I drank most of a bottle, and at some point I lay down on the floor, which I had not done in 4 months. And the last clear thought I had was that everybody was going to be so disappointed, and that I could probably just not go back, and that it would be easier for everyone. And then it was 3 a.m, and I was awake on that floor, in the dark, cold, with my coat still on. And I have never in my life felt anything like the shame of that particular hour. Here is what I want to tell you about 3 a.m. It is the loneliest number on a clock. It is too late to be up and too early to be up. Nobody is awake at 3. There is nobody to call at 3. 3 a.m. is where you find out exactly how much of your own weight you can carry. I called him. I do not have a noble reason. I did not call because I had grown or because I had learned anything. I called because I was on the floor and I did not want to die, and I could not think of one other number in that phone that had a person behind it who would still pick up. It rang 4 times. And then a voice like gravel in a bucket said, "Yeah." I did not say anything for a long time. I could hear him breathing, and I could hear a clock somewhere in his house, and I could hear the furnace kick on, and I could not make my mouth work. And he did not hang up. He did not say hello again. He did not say, "Carla, is that you? Do you know what time it is?" He waited about 20 seconds, which is a very long time on a telephone. And then he said, "All right, where are you?" I said, "My mother's house." He said, "Is anybody with you?" I said, "No." He said, "Is the door unlocked?" And I said, "I think so." And he said, "Leave it." And I heard him put the phone down on something hard. He lived 11 minutes away in good weather. It took him 25 that night. 77 years old, in the dark, in February, on roads that had not been touched since 8 in the evening, in a pickup older than my car. I was still on the floor when the headlights came across the ceiling. I heard the storm door and then his boots, and I remember being flooded with a kind of panic I cannot really describe, because I did not want to be seen like that by the one person who thought I was doing all right. He came into the back room, and he looked at me, and he looked at the bottle on the counter. And here is exactly what he said. He said, "Okay." That was it. Okay. Like a man reading a repair estimate. Then he said, "Are you hurt?" I said, "No." He said, "Did you drive?" I said, "No, the car did not start. That is the whole reason." And I started to cry. And he said, "Good. That is the only question that could not wait." And he went and put the kettle on. In my dead mother's kitchen. At 3 in the morning. Opening the cupboards until he found where she kept the mugs. We sat at that table until the sky went from black to that dirty gray that passes for dawn in February. He did not lecture me once. He did not say, "I told you so." He did not ask me the question I was braced for, which was, "Why did you not call before?" Because he already knew the answer, and because asking it would have been for him and not for me. At one point I said, "I threw away 4 months." And he said the thing that I have since repeated to probably 100 people, and that I will repeat to you now, because it might be the single most useful sentence anybody ever handed me. He said, "You did not throw them away. You still know how to fold the sheet. You still know that Eleanor likes it off her collar. You still know the walk along the lake. All of that is still in you. You do not get to keep the number, but nobody can take the 4 months." Then he said, "The number is not a trophy. The number is a mile marker. Anybody who makes you feel like the number is a trophy is telling you about themselves, not about you." I asked him if I had to tell people. He said, "You do not have to do anything." Then he said, "But the meeting is at 7 tomorrow, and I will be sitting in the second row." He washed both mugs before he left. He put them in the rack upside down, the way you do. Then he went out to a truck with no heat to speak of, and drove home through the snow to be up at 5, because he was still, at 77, taking care of an old dog and a house that ate money. I want to say something here, because I have thought about that night for 5 years now, and it took me a long time to understand what actually happened in that kitchen. He did not save me. I want to be really clear. Nobody can do that part. He did not have a speech. He did not know some technique. He was not trained. He was an old man with bad knees who put his boots on in the middle of the night and drove 25 minutes to sit in a stranger's kitchen and not say very much. That is all it was. That is all it ever is. The whole architecture of getting a person through a bad night is somebody deciding that their own sleep is less important than your 3 in the morning, and then acting like it was nothing. I went to the meeting the next night. That was the hardest room I have ever walked into. Harder than the courthouse. Harder than the salon when I went back to apologize. Because I had been coming for 4 months, and people knew me by then. And I had helped make the coffee. And I had a place I sat. They asked if anybody was new or coming back, and my ears were roaring, and I put my hand up and said, "My name is Carla, and I have 1 day." And here is what happened, and it is the reason I am still walking into that basement 5 years later, and the reason I will be walking into it next Thursday. They clapped. Not politely. The kid with the bouncing knee whooped. The guy in scrubs reached over and squeezed my shoulder hard enough to hurt. A woman I had never spoken to leaned across and said, "Welcome back, honey. We were worried." Nobody was disappointed in me. Not one person. The disappointment was entirely something I had built in my own head out of my own materials. And it had felt so real that it almost kept me home. Walt handed me a 24-hour chip after. Plastic. Probably cost 4 cents. He put it in my palm and closed my fingers over it and said, "Same time Thursday." I still have that one. It is in the drawer with the others. Now, the Bluebird. It took me 9 days to go back in there, and the only reason I finally did is that the bus stop is right there, and it was 17 degrees. I sat at the counter instead of the booth, because I did not deserve the booth, which is the kind of arithmetic your head does when you are new and full of shame. And Donna came down the counter with the pot, and she stopped in front of me, and she looked at me over the top of her reading glasses for about 3 seconds. And she said, "Booth is open." I said, "Donna, I had a slip." And she said, "I know." And then she said, "Booth is open." And I want you to sit with how much that is. She did not need my confession. She did not want the details. She was not going to make me perform contrition to earn a hot cup of coffee, because in her view, I had never had to earn it in the first place. I moved to the booth. The eggs came. The kitchen made a mistake again. And that was the night she finally told me why. She sat down across from me, which she had never done in 4 months, and she took her glasses off and let them hang, and she rubbed the bridge of her nose, and she said, "Can I tell you something?" She had a son, Danny, 41 years old by then. She had a picture in her wallet from his high school graduation, which she showed me. A big, grinning kid in a gown, holding his cap up in one hand. She had not seen him in 6 years. She knew he had been in Columbus, and then she thought Dayton. And there had been a stretch of about 18 months where she did not know if he was alive. And then a phone call from a hospital in Ohio. And then nothing again. She said, "When you came in here that first night with your $3, you were about the age he was the last time I saw his face." And she said, "I cannot do one single thing for my son. Not one. I have called every number. I have driven down there twice. He does not want to be found by me." And then she said the sentence I have thought about more than almost anything anybody has ever said to me. She said, "So I feed you, and I figure somewhere out there, in some other town, there is a woman my age putting a plate down in front of my kid and not asking him any questions. That is the deal I made. I do not know who I made it with, but that is the deal." I did not know what to say. I still do not, really. I reached across the table and took her hand, which was a thing I would never have dared do the week before. And we sat there in a booth in a diner in February in a town beside a cold lake. 2 women holding hands over a plate of eggs, and neither of us said anything else about it. She got up after a minute and went and refilled somebody's cup because there were other tables and the world does not stop. I want to say something about the shape of that because it matters. Everybody in this story is somebody's project and somebody's helper at the same time. Walt drove out at 3 in the morning because in 1989 a man named Sal had driven out for him. Donna fed me because she could not feed her own son. Nothing in this story is charity. It is all traffic. It all just moves through. That is the part I did not understand at the beginning, when I thought I was the one being carried and everybody else was fine. Nobody in that basement was fine. That is why they were in the basement. So, day 1, again, and this time I did it differently. I did the thing people talk about and almost nobody does, which is that I went to a meeting every single day for 90 days. Not because it is a rule, there is no rule, but because Walt suggested it and I had run out of better ideas of my own. 90 days. In Erie. In February and March and April, which are functionally the same month here. Some nights there were 6 people. One night there were 3, and we sat in a circle of folding chairs in a room built for 40, and it was one of the best hours of my life. I learned the town by its church basements, the one in the west side with the good cookies, the Saturday morning one in the back of a bowling alley that smelled permanently of shoe spray, the Sunday night one where a woman named Ruth, 86 years old, sober since the Nixon administration, would say the same 5 words every week when it was her turn, and never one word more. She would say, "Still here, still grateful, still surprised." And we did the work. That is the part nobody wants to hear about, because it is not cinematic. I wrote things down. I made a list of every person I had lied to, stolen from, frightened, or bailed on. And it took me 3 weeks, and there were 41 names on it, and I hated every hour of it. Walt read it with me at his kitchen table, with the dog under the chair. It took 2 evenings. When we were done, he closed the notebook and pushed it back across the table and said, "All right, now the boring part. The boring part is that you go fix what can be fixed. Not with a speech, not with a big emotional scene where the other person forgives you and everybody cries. You go and you say the true thing, plainly, and then you ask what you can do. And then, and this is the part that separates the people who mean it from the people who are performing, you do it, even when it is expensive and slow." I started with Frank, the mailbox. I had his address from the paperwork. Walt drove me out there on a Saturday in April because my license did not cover social calls, and he sat in that truck with the radio off for the whole 2 hours and never once asked me what was said in that house. I sat beside him in the driveway for 10 minutes before I could make myself get out. He was on the porch, 76 years old, or 77 by then, in the same bathrobe for all I know. And when I told him who I was, he said, "Oh, I remember you." And I braced. And he said, "You want a cup of coffee?" His wife had died the year before mine. He had a garage full of a lifetime of tools, and a table saw he did not use anymore. He and I sat in that kitchen for 2 hours. I gave him the envelope with $400 in it, which was most of what I had, for the mailbox and the corner of the fence, and he tried 3 times to give it back, and I told him if he did not take it, he was going to make it harder for me, and that shut him up. Then he said something I did not expect. He said, "You know, I sat on that porch for about a week after, thinking about how that could have been my grandson coming around that curve the other way." And then he said, "And then I thought, well, it was not. And then I thought about how young you looked sitting on that road." He said, "I am glad you came." And then he said, "Do not come back and apologize again. Once is respect, twice is you asking me to make you feel better." That is the sharpest thing anybody said to me that whole year, and it came from a man in a bathrobe with a table saw he did not use. Renee took longer than anybody. I called her in the middle of May and got voicemail, which I expected, and I did not leave a long message because Walt had told me that the long message is for you and not for them. I said, "It is Carla. I am 91 days sober. I am not calling for anything. I just wanted you to have the number." She called back in the last week of July. 10 weeks of nothing. I had to sit with that, and the sitting was the whole point. We met at a place out by the mall because neither of us wanted to do it in a house. And we sat across from each other in a booth, and she looked at me the way you look at a bridge you are not sure will hold your weight. She had a list too. It turns out I was not the only one who had been writing things down. Hers was longer and more specific than mine, and it included things I truly did not remember, which is its own kind of horror. And I sat there and let her read the whole thing, and did not defend myself once, which Walt had told me would be the hardest hour of the year. And he was right. At the end of it, she said, "Are you going to do this again?" And I said, "I do not know." I said, "I have today." I said, "I am not going to promise you a thing I cannot control, because I have already given you enough promises like that." And my sister put her hands flat on the table and looked at the ceiling and cried. And then she said, "That is the first true thing you have said to me in 6 years." We did not fix it that day. That is not how it works. We did coffee once a month for a while, then twice. It was 13 months before I was in her house, and 15 before I was alone with her kids. And I never once asked for either of those things, because they were not mine to ask for. Her older boy is 14 now. He calls me Aunt Carr, which started when he was 3 and could not get all the way to the end of my name, and which has outlived every reason it ever had to exist. And Paula from the salon. I went in on a Tuesday when I knew it would be slow. I did not call ahead because I did not want to give her a chance to prepare something kind. She was at the desk, and she saw me come through the door, and I watched her face do about 4 things. I said, "I am not here for a job." I said, "I am here because I let you down in front of a bride, and because you gave me a chair when I had nothing, and because I said things about you in this town that were not true, and that I said because I was ashamed." She let me finish, which took about 90 seconds. And then she came around the desk and hugged me so hard she lifted me off my heels, which is a feat because I am not small. And then she stepped back and said, "How long?" I said, 4 months and change." She said, "Come back and see me at a year." I want to be honest about how that felt, because at the time it stung. I had come in expecting to be turned away, and instead I got a door held open a foot, and some part of me still wanted the whole door. But she was right. She was completely right. Paula had 8 women depending on that shop, and a landlord, and a reputation, and I had already cost her a bride. What she gave me was the truest thing she had, which was a date. I came back at a year and 2 weeks. She had the chair by the window ready. She had had it ready for a month. Getting my license back, the cosmetology one, was not dramatic either. I had started on it months before I ever walked back into Paula's shop. It was a form, and back fees, and a certain number of classroom hours because mine had lapsed past the grace period, and a money order, and then 9 weeks of waiting. I took the classes on Saturday mornings in a strip mall with 19-year-olds who were just starting out and who thought I was somebody's mom. One of them, a girl named Brianna, asked me on the last day why a woman my age was bothering. And I said, "Because I let mine go." And she said, "How do you let something like that go?" And I said, slowly, and then all at once, and I do not think she understood, and I hope she never has to. The first client in my new chair was Renee. My sister sat down in front of me and took her glasses off and put them in her purse and said, "Do not make me look like Mom." I made her look a little like Mom. She has not forgiven me for it, and she has been back every 6 weeks for 4 years. Now, if this were a movie, that would be the end. Woman gets sober, gets the chair back, gets the sister back, fade out. But real life keeps going past the point where the credits would roll. And the next part is the part I think about most. Somewhere in my second year, I started going out to a house on the west side on Sunday mornings. It is a recovery house for women, 11 beds, run out of an old duplex by a woman named Charlene, who has been doing it for 2 decades on almost no money. I brought a folding chair and a towel and my shears, and I set up in the kitchen, and I cut hair. That is all. Nobody asked me to. I asked Charlene if it would be all right, and she looked at me like I had offered to pay her water bill. You would not believe what a haircut does for a woman who has just come out of the worst 2 years of her life. Or maybe you would. Maybe you have had a week where the only thing you could control was one small thing, and you did that one small thing, and it held the whole rest of the day up. They come in with their arms crossed, every single one of them. They sit down like they are being sent to the principal, and about 4 minutes in, when the water is warm and somebody's hands are in their hair and nobody is asking them a single question, something in their shoulders comes down about an inch. And then they talk. They always talk. I told you at the beginning that people tell you everything when you have your hands on their head. And it is truer in that kitchen than it ever was in the salon. I do not give advice. I learned that from Walt, and I learned it from Donna. I say almost nothing. I say, that is a lot. I say, how long? I say, there is a meeting Tuesday at 7 on the corner of that street with the stone church, and the coffee is bad, and I sit in the 3rd row. Some of them come, some of them do not. I do not keep score, and I could not tell you the percentage if you paid me, and it took me 2 full years to be able to say that sentence honestly. That brings me to the 3rd year, and to the part of this I still have trouble telling without stopping. In the spring of my 3rd year, Donna started missing shifts. You have to understand, Donna did not miss shifts. Donna had worked at that diner for a long time and had a personal record of some ridiculous number of years without calling out, and she was smug about it in the mildest way, the way people are about the one thing they have that nobody can take. I noticed because I had been sitting in that booth almost every week for 3 years by then, and because a girl named Carla was covering nights, and did not know that the man at the counter takes his coffee before he sits down. It was cancer. It was the fast kind. She had known for a while, and she had told the owner, a man named Nick, who has run that place since his father ran it. And she had told her doctor. And she had told exactly nobody else. Because that is the kind of woman she was. I found out because I went in on a Tuesday, and Nick came out from behind the register and stood in front of me with a towel over his shoulder and said, "Sit down, Carla." I did her hair in a hospital room in June. She asked me to. She called me herself, which she had never done, and she said, and I quote her exactly, "My hair looks like a squirrel died on my head, and I am not going out like this." So I brought a basin and a pitcher and the good shears, and a nurse helped me get her sitting up, and I washed my friend's hair in a plastic tub in a hospital bed, and cut it the way she had worn it since probably 1982. And while I was doing it, she said, "Do me a favor." I said, "Anything." She said, "When it is time, do it again." She said, "I do not want some stranger from the funeral home doing my hair. They always make it look like a helmet." I said, "Donna." And she said, "Carla," in that voice she used on drunks at 11 at night. And I said, "Okay," and I finished the back, and neither of us said another word about it. And then we watched about 40 minutes of a home renovation show without talking. Now here is the part I have to tell carefully, because it is not mine. 2 months before she went into the hospital, Donna had let me write a letter. I had asked her, more than once over 3 years, whether I could try. She always said no. She said she had already used up every card she had, and she was not going to have some woman from the diner chasing her son around Ohio. But that spring she said yes. I think she said yes because she already knew what the scans said, though she did not tell me that until later. So I wrote to Danny. I did not write it as his mother's friend. I wrote it as a woman who used to sit in the last booth with $3. And I told him exactly that. And I told him what his mother had said about the deals she made with nobody in particular. About feeding me and hoping somebody, somewhere, was feeding him. I sent it to the last address she had, which was 6 years old, and I sent a copy to a program in Dayton that had shown up on a piece of paper in her wallet. And I told him where she worked and how to reach me. And then I did not think about it. Because you cannot think about a letter like that and stay sane. He called me in July, from a number in Ohio, a man's voice, very careful, the way people talk when they have practiced the sentence in the car. He said, "Is she still at the Bluebird?" I said, "She is at St. Vincent, on the 4th floor." There was a long silence, and then he said, "I have 11 months. Like he was handing me a resume. Like he needed a stranger to tell him whether 11 months was enough to be allowed in the room. I said, "Danny, she does not care about the number." He said, "I care about the number." And I said, "Okay, then come anyway." He got there on a Thursday. I was not in the room, and I did not go anywhere near that floor for 2 days. Because there are moments that do not need an audience. And because I had already been given more of that family than I had any right to. Nick shut the diner for 2 hours on the day of the funeral, which he had never done for anything, and the parking lot was so full that people were on the grass along the road. I did her hair the morning of, in a back room at the funeral home, and I did not make it look like a helmet, and my hands did not shake, and I want that on the record, because 4 years earlier, I could not hold a comb steady enough to part a line. Danny spoke. 11 months and change, in a suit that did not fit, in front of a room full of people who had known his mother since he was in a stroller. He talked for maybe 3 minutes. He said he was not going to stand up there and tell everybody what a great son he was. He said, "My mother fed people. That is what she did. She fed people whether or not they deserved it, which, if you think about it, is the only way feeding people works." And then he said, "I got sober in a church basement in Dayton with a plate of eggs in front of me, and I did not know until this year that somebody was probably paying for those eggs." There were about 90 people in that room, and I do not think one of them was breathing. Walt was there, in the back, in a jacket I had never seen. He was 80 by then. He drove himself, which I had opinions about, and I kept them to myself, because he had never once told me what to do with my own 2 feet. Afterward, Nick took Donna's name tag, the little plastic one with the bird on it, and he pinned it up on the wall behind the register, next to a picture of his father. And it is still there tonight. And I started going to the Bluebird on Sundays. Not Tuesdays and Thursdays, when I have meetings. Sundays, late afternoon, when it is slow. I sit in the last booth, the one by the window with the crack in the vinyl. And I have coffee, and I do the crossword badly, and I stay about 90 minutes. And here is my arrangement with Nick, which we made about 2 years ago, and which we have never once discussed since. Every Sunday, before I leave, I pay for whatever the kitchen gets wrong. That is how we say it. The kitchen makes mistakes at the Bluebird. It has always made a remarkable number of mistakes. and it makes more of them in the winter. And it makes the most of them on nights when the meeting up the street lets out, and somebody comes in with $3 and change and sits down at the counter with their coat still on. Kayla knows. The new kid on weekends, Trevor, he knows. Nobody says anything to anybody. A plate goes down in front of somebody who did not order it, and the words are always the same. And the words are, "Kitchen made this wrong. It is going in the trash otherwise." I did not invent that. I inherited it. That is the whole point of it. So, tonight, 5 years, which, when I do the arithmetic, is about 1,826 days, if you count the leap year, and I did every single one of them the same way, which is by not drinking during the daytime and then going to bed. There were maybe 30 people in the basement. Renee came, and both boys, and the older one wore a tie without being asked, which almost finished me off right there. Paula closed the shop 20 minutes early and came with 2 of the girls. Charlene came from the recovery house with 4 women from the current house, 2 of whom have less than 60 days, and sat there with their arms crossed exactly the way I did. Danny drove up from Ohio. He will have 3 years in August. He works for a heating company. He brings me a jar of his mother's apple butter every fall, out of a batch she made the year before she died, and that he has been rationing at what I calculate is a rate designed to last him the rest of his life. Ruth was there, 91 years old now, in the same chair she has sat in since before I was born, and when it came around to her, she said what she always says. Still here, still grateful, still surprised. And Walt, he is 82. He uses a cane now, and he is furious about it. And he still gets there 15 minutes early to make the coffee that nobody likes, because he says a man should have a job. He stood up, which took a minute, and he did not make a speech, because he has never made a speech in his life. He held up the chip so people could see it, and he said, "This one is Carla's." And then he said, "She called me at 3 in the morning one time, and she thought that was the worst night of her life." And he said, "It was the best phone call I ever got, because I had a use." And then he put it in my hand and closed my fingers over it, the same way he did with the 24-hour chip in that same room, standing on that same concrete floor. And he said the same 4 words he said the very first night I ever met him, which are, "Same time, Thursday." Here is what happened next, since I know that is what you are lying there waiting for. I bought Renee's half of our mother's house 2 years ago. It took a bank 3 tries to believe I was a good idea, and the interest rate is nothing to write home about. But the deed has my name on it. The back room is a 1-chair shop now. There is a sign in the window my nephew made in shop class. It says my name, and under it, by appointment. I have 31 regulars and a waiting list of 9, and I do not take walk-ins. And on Sunday mornings, before the diner, I do the recovery house. And in the front room, in the little drawer of the table by the door, where my mother used to keep the rubber bands and the church envelopes, I keep chips. 24-hour chips. I buy them 100 at a time. Because here is what I know now that I did not know 6 years ago. Somebody is going to come into my kitchen shaking. It happens about 4 times a year. Somebody's cousin, somebody from the house, a woman who sat down in my chair to get her roots done and started crying into the cape instead. And when that happens, I do not have a speech either. I have never had one. I put the kettle on, and I sit down across from them at my mother's table. And I let them not talk for as long as they need to. And then, at some point, I open that drawer. You do not have to want it yet. That is what I tell them. You do not have to want this yet. You just have to be here, and then be here again. And one day, you will look up and notice you want it. And I tell them the other thing, too. The thing about 3 in the morning. Because I said earlier that 3 in the morning is the loneliest number on a clock. That nobody is awake at 3. That there is nobody to call. And I believed that with my whole chest, lying on the floor of my mother's back room with my coat on. It is not true. It is the biggest lie the worst hour of the night tells you. Somebody is always awake at 3 in the morning. There is an old man with bad knees and a phone on the nightstand. There is a woman on a night shift folding sheets in a hot room. There is a waitress somewhere putting a plate down in front of somebody's son. The phone rings at my house now, sometimes, at that hour. Not often, 3 or 4 times a year. And I answer it, and I do not say hello twice, and I do not ask what time it is. I say, "All right, where are you?" So that is the story. There is no villain in it. Nobody got what was coming to them. Nobody got destroyed, and nobody got exposed, and there is no folder of receipts, and no courtroom, and the closest thing to justice in the entire thing is an old man in a bathrobe telling a woman in his kitchen not to apologize twice. What there is instead is a plate of eggs, and a ride across town, and a phone answered at 3 in the morning, and 100 other things so small that not one of them would look like anything if you saw it happen. That is what saved my life. Not a revelation, not rock bottom, not willpower, which I have never had much of. A series of unremarkable kindnesses delivered by tired people who had every reason to be somewhere else, over and over, for long enough that I could not keep believing I was alone. Let that be the thing you take to sleep tonight. Somewhere in your life there is a person who is 1 plate of eggs away from a different year. You will probably never know which one it was. Donna did not know. To the end of her life, she thought that all she had ever done for me was hand over food that was going in the trash anyway. Rest now. Let your shoulders come down. Picture a long, low diner beside a cold lake with a hand-painted bird on the window and the lights on late, and one booth by the window with a crack in the vinyl, and a cup that never gets below halfway, and somebody coming toward you across the room who is not going to ask you a single question. That booth is yours tonight. Sleep well. I will see you in the next one. Before you drift off, tell me something in the comments if you have it in you. Who is the person in your life who did the small, unglamorous thing at exactly the right time? The ride, the meal, the phone answered when they did not have to answer it. And did you ever get to tell them what it did? And if you were the one lying awake tonight counting days, tell me your number, whether it is 5 years or 5 hours. Because somebody in these comments will be glad to see it. As always, drop your state and how old you are so I know who is out there resting with me tonight. Sleep well. You are not as alone as this hour is telling you.